Hello and welcome to another episode of the World War II podcast. I'm Angus Wallace. If you cast your minds back to episode 103, I discussed Eric Dorman-Smith with James Colvin. At the time, James was busy researching and writing a book about the British Army in North Africa, its tactics and training, in an effort to explain the difficulties the 8th Army had in fighting the Afrika Korps. James's book, 8th Army versus Rommel, was released last year, but I've only recently found the time to read it. And what a cracking book it is. In this episode, I've asked James back to discuss the war in North Africa. Now, we have Chris Canfield, patron of the podcast, to thank for this episode. Whilst perusing the records at the Bovington Tank Museum here in the UK, Chris met James and suggested the two of us should have a chat. If any of you guys listening fancy becoming a patron of the podcast, you can find out more at patreon.com/WW2podcast. So it's thanks to listeners like Chris, I can find the time to put the show together. So that's patreon.com/WW2podcast if you fancy becoming a patron. James, welcome back and congratulations on the book. So as so much of the Second World War is actually the problems of pre-war. Shall we talk about those interwar years? How much can we trace the problems in North Africa back to those interwar years before the war? And perhaps the tank enthusiasts, are they to blame? People like Little Hartfull, and indeed there's Hobart out there as well, just before the war, isn't he? Actually in the field with the I forgot what the unit's called now, but
I mean, the British Army actually, by 1918 it was an extremely efficient force. It was much the best of any of the Allied armies, and it's a cracking victory at Amiens in 1918, Black Day of the German Army, Ludendorff called it. But for the next 15 years, it really limited itself to acting as a kind of imperial police force looking after the empire. It didn't plan or even really think much about European war at all. And it wasn't until about 1938, I think, was when Hore-Belisha became defense minister, and they actually decided they had to do something to reorganize the army. They obviously acknowledged technological developments such as tanks and aircraft, but there's no finance to procure them, and no opportunity to train or organize either. And the keen young officers who could see the future and what the future might hold in store for them, they tended to adopt the more extreme ideas of the military intellectuals like Little Hart and Fuller, who preached gospels of big tank formations with no supporting arms, or indirect approach and maneuver warfare rather than actual battle. And they couldn't test these ideas on exercises because there simply weren't the troops in the UK to have exercises with. They had a little flurry of looking at the problems of mechanized forces around 1930, but it was a very short-lived experiment, and not a lot happened after that in terms of developing either doctrine or building up mechanized forces until, as I said, about 1938, when the first post-war tanks really began to come into service, post-First World War tanks, that is. And so there was no doctrine for armoured forces or thought really given to cooperation between infantry, armour and artillery, which was the crucial thing, because none of those arms on their own actually are going to be hugely effective. You do need the combination of all three. And the first serious armoured division that was formed was the 7th Armoured Division under Hobart in North Africa in 1939. And he was very much a disciple of Little Hart and Fuller, and thought fleets of armour over the desert would be a wonderful way of sweeping the enemy into the sea. And that armour would be impeded by wheeled vehicles such as the artillery and the infantry were employed. He was sacked just before the Second World War, quite rightly actually. He was grossly impertinent to the general commanding, and who actually did believe in a mixture of arms. And they had a major exercise where General Jumbo Wilson was going to grace the exercise with his presence. And Hobart made absolutely sure that he got totally lost in the desert and didn't see a damn thing. And Wilson sacked him as a result. He was promoted to Lance Corporal and sent back to the UK, apparently. And so that basically was the state of play when war actually broke out. There was really no thought had been given to modern technology and how to use it. And there was a handful of tanks, either infantry tanks handed out to the Royal Tank Regiment to support infantry, or rather lightly armoured cruiser tanks, as they called them, issued to the cavalry regiments. And those were the two roles that tanks were given in the British Army, without any thought really of how they should be deployed in action.
I do wonder if Liddell, Hart and Fuller kind of have their reputation cemented for the simple reason they're the two big names that you can hang any form of doctrine off. I'm not sure how many other people were writing about tank warfare and tank doctrine in Britain, so you kind of got to go with what's widely available.
Well, Liddell Hart was hugely influential, and he's a very widely read journalist. His books sold in vast quantities, and he worked for the Times and the Telegraph and wrote reports on exercises criticising the senior officers. He was offered command of a brigade in Egypt in the early 1930s, and he declined that in case his reputation was besmirched by his failure. But one of the senior British generals said he would never read anything by Liddell Hart because he knew it would only annoy him. The only thing he knew about Liddell Hart was that he drove a Rolls Royce and sent his son to Eton. And he wasn't at all impressed by that.
Certainly a peculiar character.
Yeah.
So, and if we're looking therefore at the officers in the desert that will be prominent during the war, I'm assuming they'll all be of an age. They probably all had a not dissimilar experiences. Are they of a type? I mean, is this a problem that would ultimately stifle thinking in the desert?
They're certainly all of a type. Almost all have been privately educated and had the same sort of innate values of loyalty and compliance with orders, team spirit, duty, hard work, ethical behaviour, that kind of thing. They're quite an admirable bunch in many ways, but they didn't have the same cutting edge that the average German Wehrmacht officer had. They weren't ambitious for themselves particularly, not in general. They didn't look on war as something that was, they thought it was rather distasteful business. Their job was to keep the peace, in fact. And it's quite a different mindset. The junior German officers, they revelled in the idea of tanks. So the aristocratic German Prussians, they abandoned their cavalry regiments and queued up to join the panzer divisions. Quite the reverse in Britain. The Royal Tank Regiment was composed really of people who didn't come from the upper echelons of the army, socially upper echelons of the army. No cavalry officers at all joined the Royal Tank Regiment. No guards officers did. I think there was a single rifle brigade officer who joined the Royal Tank Regiment. It was otherwise mostly gunners, engineers, and some infantry who saw the future as being armour. It was socially quite a divided army in that respect. Cavalry on one side, tank regiment on the other, and they traded insults about polo sticks and garage mechanics to each other. It was quite unhealthy, in fact.
Well, yes, I was saying this comes out really in the desert, doesn't it? This competitiveness of the British regimental system seems quite good until it gets so competitive that it's almost falling over itself to create problems for itself. I
mean, the overall standard, I think, of training and military talent was quite evenly spread throughout the army, but the guards and the rifle brigade believed they were socially superior to others, and they didn't really like cooperating with tradesmen like gunners and engineers too much. They'd far rather stay by themselves and in their own little clique, and surrounded by jolly nice chaps who would all do their duty and die to the last man. That was pretty much the sort of mindset of the junior ranks, I think, in many of the regiments. Rifle brigade were probably more professional than others, but there's a great deal of amateurism.
Did you just maybe think, didn't the artillery officers go to Woolwich, and didn't they actually have to have more academic rigour than those who'd been to Sandhurst?
Well, the artillery and the engineers were certainly intellectually more able than the average infantry officer, and both of them were eligible for a couple of years at Cambridge after they finished their course at Woolwich to actually get their brain cells working. And they provided a huge number of the senior ranks in the Second World War. They were obviously much more suited to staff jobs, which needed a bit of intellect, than many of the infantry officers who'd perhaps got their O levels or the equivalent and scraped into Sandhurst and were last-ditch fighters rather than sort of organising divisional movements.
Yeah. So, and if you round off this sort of building a picture of the Eighth Army, it's a mixed force, isn't it? It's in fact it's an incredibly mixed force with Indians, South Africans, Australians, New Zealanders, plus a Free French
And French and Poles as well, actually.
Yeah. So, I mean, you've got the regiments all doing, not necessarily all have been training together. You've got all these a mixed force of other armed forces. I mean, how trained together did they? How well integrated were they? I mean, how much of a tension does this cause? And across the Dominions, if you forget the Free French and the Poles, do the Dominion troops sort of share some sort of training, similar training, or are they all going in different directions?
Well, there certainly was no centralised training really until quite late in the day. And initially, it was entirely British, the 7th Armored Division, a few other units. Others sort of joined in. But Auchinleck in particular, he resisted having a director of military training appointed for about 8 months. It wasn't until early the spring of 1942 that one was appointed. So there was not much cohesion to the training. The French in particular, they're rather antagonistic to the British anyway, after the British sank their fleet at Oran. So there's a certain amount of cold shouldering of each side. Then the Indians and the New Zealanders and the Australians weren't really any problems of integrating. They all were they're all quite keen to get stuck in actually, and they're all infantry, which is the simplest form of training really. So there was no discrepancy as far as one could tell between the sort of quality of performance between those three groups. The South Africans were rather a different problem. Their senior commanders tended to be Afrikaners, and quite a lot of them had their families incarcerated in concentration camps during the Boer War. They didn't necessarily like the British that much, and they tended to be rather recalcitrant, and their training was actually quite poor, and they were quite bad at moving across the desert and not getting lost and doing it quickly and efficiently. And they were very reluctant on occasion to accept orders from British officers who they may not have cared for, who they regarded as stuck-up toffs kind of thing. So the South Africans were actually a problem. Other than that, once in the field, the various factions worked pretty well together. The French got a bit sort of iffy at Bir Hakeim when they were besieged by very large numbers of Germans, and they didn't really feel they wanted to be sacrificed by British generals, since they were the only French who were actually fighting at that time, and they were quite keen to get out of it, which gave rise to some comment in some quarters in the British army.
So we've kind of built a picture there of the British sort of going into the desert campaign, but if we turn the tables and look at the Germans, we commented on the lack of British military sort of unifying doctrine. Had the Germans? I think the Germans had been working on doctrine as early as the 1920s, hadn't they?
Well, they've been working on doctrine since they were defeated by Napoleon, actually, in 1808. They really actually took their whole society and their military forces apart and said, we've got to start again. It isn't working for us. And they brought in some really very radical reforms then, and they opened the officer corps to all the talent rather than just to the Prussian nobles. This didn't last that long, and by a couple of decades into the 19th century, and they'd rather reverted to type. But they fought a number of wars in the 19th century, and they needed to be efficient, otherwise they failed to unify their country. And they were working on the problems of managing really large armies and fighting major wars against quite good opponents, while the British in the 19th century were simply working on defending the empire and policing their trouble spots. But the Germans did come forward with some concepts which they've carried on into the 20th century as well. One was the idea of forward leadership, what they call Auftragstaktik, basically insisting that the junior commanders are given a wide degree of initiative, because they are the only ones who really know what's happening at the front, and they must be encouraged. It must be their duty to actually take advantage of openings and of opportunities within the context of the overall aim. there was tremendous delegation of authority in the German army. You can see that in Rommel's handling of his forces in North Africa as well. He was up at the front a lot of the time, and pushing his men on, making sure that opportunities were not missed. In the First World War, they developed infiltration tactics. They're stormtroopers in 1918, and that was ideally suited, obviously, to mobile warfare as well. And Rommel, again, in the First World War initially, he sort of ripped through the Italian army that he was facing at that time in command of a relatively small force, just by infiltrating, surrounding, cutting off the opposition and wreaking havoc in much the same way as he did in the desert. But it wasn't that he was particularly talented. There were a large number of German commanders who followed the same philosophy as him, because they had all been taught it from an early stage. They took war much more seriously than the British. The British thought it was a rather distasteful business, and nobody really knew what it was doing. It was muddling and unpleasant. And the opening lines of the German military handbook, a volume called Truppenführung, described war as an art and the profession that makes the highest possible demands on the human personality. A free and creative art, they described it as, which is not at all the British mindset. They had a different appetite for it altogether. Very strange to modernise, and must have been quite strange to some of the people at the time, but there we are.
You mentioned that how effective Rommel has been, but the British must have had some idea kind of what was coming, because they did. The Bartholomew Report looks at the fall of France, doesn't it? So that comes out, and presumably that picked up some of the problems that we're going to face in the desert.
The problem with the Bartholomew Report, they had to actually, the number of people sent reports back before Dunkirk, believing that they weren't going to get back at all. They sent off to the War Office the conclusions they'd come to in the first 10 days, say, of the fighting. And Bartholomew really was working from the same kind of viewpoint. The British Army didn't experience that much fighting in the retreat to Dunkirk and around Dunkirk. Almost all the panzer divisions were directed through the Ardennes at the French, and the vast majority of the British divisions basically fought German infantry, and they fought them quite successfully. Actually, by and large, they stopped them and defended the perimeter and got themselves evacuated. It was not unsuccessful, but they didn't really learn much about German armour, so the Bartholomew Report didn't really teach them very much. There were one or two conclusions that Bartholomew came up with. One was that the British Army should be organised in relatively small mixed formations, brigade groups he called them, infantry supported by their own artillery and engineers at brigade level rather than at divisional level, which would allow more flexibility, he thought, for the junior commanders. It was all perfectly true, but nonetheless it did then diffuse British artillery, which instead of being concentrated with the three regiments normally in division, all firing at once at the same target, fairly devastating effect. You've got brigades with a dozen or 2 dozen field guns supporting that particular section of infantry. And artillery is most useful when it is concentrated in volume, in mass, and in a devastating fashion. So there was a certain amount of reluctance among elements of the British Army to actually accept that particular measure of operating in brigade groups. It did, however, catch on in North Africa, and the defects of the brigade group actually did come to light there.
On the eve of Rommel arriving there, obviously O'Connor's had that huge success with Compass, and there's another report comes out on his success. I wonder if that's actually I wonder if that report perhaps is not necessarily reporting. I'm confusing my words with what I want to say. I wonder if that report is actually a distraction, and the lessons learned from O'Connor are not necessarily useful lessons for when Rommel arrives. It's the wrong lessons are learned.
Well, the lessons actually were really fairly spot on. The trouble is no one read the report. It was a chap called Dorman-Smith, who became prominent later on, was partly responsible for compiling it. But unfortunately, Connor's troops were mostly dispersed immediately after the victory over the Italians. Some of them were sent on leave, which they well deserved. Others were sent off to Greece, where the Germans were threatening to invade. And in the general chaos engendered after Rommel's advance, the paperwork didn't get done. The report appears not to have been really circulated until 12 months after the event. And the conclusions that he came to were extremely valid. I mean, one, for example, was sort of wireless security. The British officer corps seemed to be incapable of using code words or using discretion over the wireless, as it was then called. And the Italians were listening in. And actually, one of the lines in the report says, had we been facing the Germans, it would have been very much more serious. Another of the conclusions in the report was that tanks have to be accompanied by artillery and infantry, and the idea that they will be hindered and hampered by wheeled vehicles accompanying them is simply not the case. They absolutely must have supporting arms with them in case of need. That again was not taken on board at all. The next couple of operations, you see the British Army tanks going one way, infantry, artillery quite another, with consequences that the Germans were only too happy to take advantage of. The lessons were simply not taken on board.
Someone once said to me, an X factor for a force you can never take into account is, a force that's winning. It's a real morale booster and a force multiplier. Yet, you've got this fantastic victory from Operation Compass. Yet, within months, Rommel arrives, and the British are put on the back foot. What's Rommel doing that so very, very quickly wrong-foots the British?
Well, I think in fairness, that is the one defeat that the British are fairly blameless for. It is most unfortunate, put it that way. I mean, all their experienced troops have been either sent on leave or sent off to Greece. The fresh troops that came up, I think it was the 3rd Armoured Division, in fact, had no battle experience whatsoever. It had a mere handful of tanks. It took over the tanks that remained to 7th Armoured Division when the personnel of the 7th Armoured were pulled back. There were a couple of dozen tanks. They put people into captured Italian tanks, which were pretty much death traps, and they were very heavily outnumbered by Rommel's troops. Not only that, but the British Army, the headquarters in Cairo, had been informed by Ultra that Rommel was under strict orders not to attack. And when he disobeyed orders, they were suddenly taken by surprise. And the worst thing of all, of course, was that Connor and the entire management team of the Western Desert Force was captured by German troops. And the loss of O'Connor, I think, was extraordinarily serious. He was certainly much the most able of the early desert generals. And he distinguished himself later on as a corps commander in Normandy as well, after he escaped from prison.
It's interesting when you look through. I was going to skip through really some of the operations, but I was looking at battle axe. 98 British tanks lost to 12 German. There's this big discrepancy in tank casualties. What's going wrong? Why are we losing so many tanks?
Well, they fought pretty hard, actually, and in fairness, the 98 British tanks were lost largely because the British were driven off the battlefield. The Germans could recover their own tanks, mend most of them, and the only ones that had burned out, which not many German tanks tended to do, were counted as destroyed. But they captured quite a lot of British tanks, mended them, and actually put them into service with themselves. There are quite a number of entertaining photographs of British tanks with swastikas painted on the sides. And one wonderful photograph in the Imperial War Museum of New Zealand troops liberating a British Matilda tank. And the German crew were standing there with their hands up, looking extremely worried. Very hard-bitten New Zealand soldiers they were. But essentially, the British started off with about the same number of tanks as the Germans prior to the June Operation Battle Axe. And the problem was they had infantry tanks which were slow, heavily armoured, and they had cruiser tanks which were fast and less heavily armoured. And one lot was manned by the Royal Tank Regiment, and the fast ones were manned by the cavalry. They didn't really talk to each other that much, and they operated totally separately. So half the British tanks. You've got 100 British tanks facing the 200 Germans, and the other 100 British tanks facing 88mm guns carefully dug in by Rommel, which ended up in a rather unhappy scene. So essentially, although the report from the Compass said armour must be used in mass and combined, they failed to follow that. They failed to provide infantry and artillery with the Matilda tanks, which infantry artillery could have actually taken out the 88mm guns. Meanwhile, the cruiser tanks swanned off into the blue to take on the German armour. The German armour was supported by anti-tank guns, which cunningly hid in shallows and hollows and depressions, and as much damage was done by anti-tank guns to British armour as by German tanks. British tanks at that time fired only solid shot, which really were not terribly effective against anti-tank guns. So they were on a hiding nothing, essentially. Not only that, but the British artillery was largely concentrated in what they called a support group and assigned the job of guarding the flank of the offensive. It did absolutely nothing, really. Blamed its failure on the lack of armoured cars to find targets. But really, it was completely wasted there. And again, none of these lessons was taken on board. The conclusion they took from the Battle Axe operation was essentially, we must try harder, a keen wit, fast reactions, get up earlier, move faster, is more or less what their conclusions were.
Without artillery support, does that mean that all the British tanks can do, because they're outranged by the 88, is literally do a charge?
Yeah, pretty much.
And hope they get into range to fire back?
That basically is all they could do. They didn't actually even realize then that they were 88mm guns that were taking them out. All they knew was that from nowhere, it seemed, shells were whistling through their armour plating and their tanks were brewing up. It took quite a long time for them to work out who and what was doing the damage, mainly because they lost control of the battlefield and couldn't recover the tanks that had been knocked out. So they couldn't actually tell. It was the first time they'd come across 88mm guns. There was a reluctance to learn. It was considered to admit fault and to admit failure, to put it down to something more than bad luck, accidents, and inferior equipment, rather implied that you weren't actually doing your job properly. They thought. It was a very strange mindset. They were not professionals, really, though they believed they were.
And Wavell was then replaced by Auchinleck, an Indian Army officer. I mean, does he bring anything new to the 8th Army?
Well, yes, he does, but it's not necessarily the right answer either. Dorman-Smith, who mentioned before, was Auchinleck's director of military training in India. And he was very, very much a fan of Little Heart. He got on with him quite well. I wrote to him and told him what was happening. And he took on board Little Heart's manoeuvre warfare, and that the indirect approach means you don't put in frontal attacks, and you've got to be a little bit more canny. He and his colleagues in India developed a couple of techniques that they thought would work. And one was what they call the box system. It's a method of combining tanks, artillery, and infantry. You can put an infantry brigade down in the middle of the desert and use that as a base for the armour to operate from, because they thought at that time that for one reason or another, the British armour was clearly losing the plot against the German armour. But if they had the help of field guns, protected by infantry in a kind of fortified box surrounded by mines, the British armour could retreat to that, resupply themselves, and sort of come out fighting again, which is as ponderous a method of fighting a battle as you will ever find, I think. Auchinleck really, unfortunately, was not the most communicative of men. He didn't get on particularly well with the cavalry and sort of rifle brigade influence in the 8th Army. The Indian Army was slightly looked down on socially by its colleagues in the British Army, and considered to be not quite top draw, and they were rather self-conscious about that. And he also had no network of friends in the hierarchy of the British Army. So when he was choosing subordinates and choosing people even to command the army in the field, he really didn't know people well enough to make the right choice. And his choices for the commanders of the Eighth Army for the attack that he was planning in November 1942 were really not the best at all. The offensive eventually came somewhat unstuck.
Just to go back to that box system, was that intended to be offensive and defensive?
It was indeed, yeah, it was.
So how do you offensively move your box with mines surrounding it?
Well, this is the point.
It just sounds like an obvious failing of an offensive system to build a big fortification.
Well, you can imagine what it looked like on a map. I mean, eventually, we're going forward a bit here, but this is sort of the summer of 1942. The British Army wasn't doing too well in mobile warfare, so let's make the warfare static, but let's keep advancing. So you plonk a box down 30 miles ahead of your front lines, surrounded by mines, swamping with tanks and so on, so while it's established itself. And then when that's all sort of fine and dandy, everyone's comfortably dug in, you plonk another box down, another 30 miles ahead, and do the same thing.
It's a bit like Boughton Hold from the First World War.
Well, exactly. Well, if only it had been as successful as that. But you imagine what it looks like on the map. Every 30 miles is a round sort of splodge on the map. And the people who did the probe said, look, it looks like a bunch of cowpats, they said. It was known as the cowpats, a philosophy, doctrine. And it was mocked thoroughly. And in fact, in the end, it did not work.
How radically different was it from what the Italian... O'Connor was attacking sort of Italian boxes.
You have a point. It begs an awful lot of questions, doesn't it? It really does.
It shows a slightly short memory if it's, we were successful against the Italians.
Well, that perhaps, again, is one of the effects of the British Army hierarchy being wiped out during Rommel's first offensive. You got a lot of experienced people in the bag and, not there to give them... I mean, O'Connor would have just sort of laughed it out of court, I think, if he'd been around. Plenty of people did, anyway.
Now, presumably, I mean, it's easy to look at this period of the war and focus kind of on North Africa because obviously nothing's happening in Northwest Europe, particularly. Britain, they'll be training and developing a new army. But I wonder if any of these new lessons, tactics are filtering through to North Africa. Because I noticed Crusader, the 8th Army lose 500 tanks. The British Army, the British Army lose 500 plus tanks. The Afrika Korps about 100, though it's a bit of a Pyrrhic victory, I think, for the British, really, isn't it? If you look at losses like that.
Yeah. That's the November 1941 offensive to the Crusader battle, isn't it? And they actually, I think, probably lost certainly at least 500 plus tanks and probably more. They did actually end up in personnel. They did wipe out, 35,000 German and Italian troops, mostly captured, and largely Italians who were garrisoning the strategic points around Tobruk. So it was a fairly good haul in that respect. The problem with it really was that, within a month, Rommel had bounced back to the regions of Tobruk. He'd been reinforced. He'd sort of caught, again, inexperienced British troops on the hop. They'd followed up too fast, too far. They'd advanced without artillery and infantry protection for the armour. And infantry and artillery caught separately from tanks by German armour were similarly wiped out. Then they lost another 150 tanks or so in a matter of a couple of weeks, retreating back to Tobruk, which they did hold. It was a very disappointing result to what was quite a hard-fought battle, which the British had certainly put everything they had into it. It was a creditable victory at the end of Crusader.
But are lessons filtering through from Britain? In fact, is Africa North Africa the leading edge of where it's at with British tank thinking at the time, or as it's the active theatre?
Well, there's a lot of worry in London, certainly. I mean, Churchill was as belligerent and aggressive as always, and he couldn't understand it. But the Chief of the Imperial General Staff, Field Marshal Brooke, he's a very bright chap indeed, and he could not understand it. And there are all these disasters that by this time going on in Singapore. Singapore had fallen, the Japanese were rampaging up through Burma, and the British couldn't even cope with a couple of German divisions in North Africa. So he actually took a very keen interest in what was going on there. He wanted to appoint a director of military training, which Auchinleck resisted. I think he wanted to keep control of it himself. Brooke wanted to get Dorman-Smith out, and Auchinleck hung on to him like grim death. Brooke did manage to get the director of intelligence in Cairo sacked. Rightly so, he was fairly hopeless. And there was a little bit better sort of forecasting of German intentions after that. But none of it was deep enough. It needed a radical reform, really. And the great problem, really, in the spring of 1942, after the victory at Crusader and followed by the defeat, the great problem really was, as the British were re-equipping, at last with some reasonable equipment in terms of tanks and anti-tank guns, they really still had no doctrine, no tactical philosophy with which to employ their new equipment. Regiments tended to evolve their own tactics whenever suited them. Brigades, similarly. The two armoured divisions in the desert, the 1st and 7th Armoured, were commanded by men who actually did not like each other at all, didn't trust each other, and refused to cooperate. Auchinleck installed a system of brigade groups, rather in line with the Bartholomew idea. And he said the virtue of this was that you could switch brigades from one division to another, and no flexibility was the name of the game. Unfortunately, as far as the armoured brigades were concerned, the armoured division commanders couldn't stand each other, and when the brigades they had trained were switched to another division, and they received a brigade which had been trained in a different fashion, they were not too happy about that at all. The army simply was fairly dysfunctional by the time the Germans attacked in May 1942. It wasn't a very happy bunch of bunnies at all.
Auchinleck Reg takes direct control and he stops the Afrika Korps at Alameda. You always seem pretty hard on Auchinleck, and I was always been vaguely sympathetic to him for taking direct control and actually stopping the army. But is that basically was Auchinleck's problem really that he just lacked grip?
He had more grip than the person he actually appointed to command the field army, who had no grip at all. Ritchie had a consultative style of command, and he got up in the morning, probably been up all night actually, reading the reports coming in. He'd bring up his corps commanders. They all have a conference. By about midday, they decide what to do. They'd send the orders out to the divisions and the brigades. They'd get moving about 3 in the afternoon. By that time, the afternoon haze in the desert was getting up. You couldn't see anything. 6 o'clock it would clear. You'd have about an hour of light in which to fulfill the objectives that had been planned around 11, 12 o'clock in the day. It was really absolutely hopeless. It was a terrible, terrible way of commanding an army. The antithesis of what the Germans did. And, the Germans would just need to take out that particular British box and leave it up to the man on the spot to sort out how to do it. Speed of reaction of German troops to orders was phenomenally quicker than that of the British. It really was.
Monty's posted over, and he's a dreadfully Marmite figure. People love him and hate him. And I wonder how much you think he is the sort of saviour of North Africa. What's his radical thing that he does that somehow changes the British prospects in the Middle East?
Well, he's very clear in what he wants to achieve. Auchinleck was not only not clear, but he failed to communicate anything at all. And there's not a single record of him visiting troops or giving anybody a pep talk. Nobody quite knew what was happening. Nobody knew whether they were going to stay at Alamein or retreat. Montgomery came in. He said, "We are not going to retreat from here. We stay here, living, or we stay here dead, but we stay here." He actually destroyed all the plans for withdrawal. And the plans that Auchinleck had drawn up in case of they were forced to withdraw would have been a complete disaster. It would have involved very, very complicated movement under pressure by British forces. Not something they had any record of success in at all. And it would have depended on counterattacks from British tanks, of which at that time there really were none. So it was simply a non-runner. What Montgomery really brought was clarity and simplicity and conviction. And he said his first words to the staff, his first orders, as I said, was to burn the plans for retreat. And he did stick to that. Not everybody liked him, but that didn't really matter that much anyway. What mattered was that a large number of people did actually care for him. He wasn't a brilliant tactician, but he didn't have a very clever army either. and he evolved tactics and plans that actually suited the fairly sort of mechanistic, regimented way in which the British Army operated.
What amused me is, just glancing at my notes, is that the big factor was that he gets a grip and basically fires everybody. If you disagree with him, you're out. It's as simple as that. He seems to go through him like a dose of salt.
Well, he probably fired quite a lot. He kept quite a lot as well, actually, and had to fire them later. But there were some absolute shockers. And there's a chap called Lumsden who commanded the Armoured Corps at Alamein, and he had a terrible reputation. I mean, people who served under him loved him because he would look after their interests and make sure they got all the good jobs and stuff. He would issue orders on occasion, to subordinates verbally. If the plan came off, he took the credit. If it didn't come off, he blamed the person he'd given the order to. He had a terrible reputation for that. There's a guy called Renton who'd been promoted by Auchinleck to command 7th Armour Division. And he told Montgomery at the first meeting they had that the big question would be when to let loose the armour. And Montgomery's view was that the armour had been let loose far too often and achieved absolutely nothing. So Renton got sacked almost immediately. So it's quite clear he was not on side, and Montgomery was not going to be told what to do by anybody. Lumsden he got rid of after Alamein, and quite rightly so, in my view. And he brought in some very good people indeed. He brought in Horrocks, for example, who was an excellent corps commander throughout the war. Very, very good at motivating people and getting people on side. Very nice manner as well. Made up in charm for what he made up for what Montgomery lacked in charm. He kept some extremely good people. He appointed a chap called de Gangon as chief of staff, who was brilliant. He had a wonderful. He kept on some very, very good staff officers who'd been very disillusioned under Auchinleck. Williams at intelligence and Richardson in charge of planning. So he kept the good stuff. Actually, he really did. He promoted a chap called Harding to command 7th Armour Division. Harding became chief of the Imperial General Staff in the 50s. He was about the only non-public school frontline general to emerge in the British Army in the Second World War. His father was a postman in a village not very far from where we live, in fact.
Some of the problems, really, with the British Army pre-Montgomery, is it as fundamentally as simple as a sort of a cultural failure of the British Army in North Africa to essentially learn through poor leadership? Well,
yeah, I mean, it's a style of leadership, really, as much as anything. They had this sort of club mentality where everybody's basically a jolly nice chap and nobody could be too rude about anybody else. You didn't want to shout at people and give them sort of orders they didn't like. You had to sort of talk to them and make sure everybody was happy. It's very odd. It was not at all professional, not even in a business sense, really. You've got to keep people on side, but you've got to achieve your objectives, and they failed to really do either in the end. It continued, in fact, after the North African campaign. There was a New Zealand brigadier called Hargest who served in North Africa, and he went over to Normandy in 1944 as an observer to report back because he'd seen enough action himself. And he was quite shocked at the behaviour of 7th Armour Division, which was also in Normandy, and about how they still had not grasped the importance of combining tanks, artillery and infantry. They had many of the same regiments that had been in North Africa. They're commanded by a chap called Erskine, who'd been a senior staff officer, a very able one in North Africa. They still also had a sort of club atmosphere. It was, Charles, I wonder if you'd mind going over to Vieux-Bocage and working that out. And Charles goes off to Vieux-Bocage, says, nothing much happening here. So he stopped all his tanks in the street. And they all mill around having a cup of tea. I'm sure they were having a cup of tea and looking at maps. And suddenly a Tiger tank appears, manned by Lieutenant Fitman. I'm sure you know the story. And it wipes out half of the armoured battalion facing them and sets back the campaign by about 3 weeks. They could have actually got through the Bocage countryside had it not been for Erskine's 7th Armour Division and this lunatic who was in charge of the County of London Yeomanry, who also had a history of failure in the desert. It would be funny if it wasn't so serious.
My father was billeted at one point in Villers Bocage in 1944, and so my father. So when I went over with him, 30 years ago, he was very excited to walk around Villers Bocage and point out the wreckage that was no longer there. With it in such a big story, although that'll before my father never landed until September 44, so he missed all that. But it was clearly imprinted upon them all, that story when they were billeted there. James, thanks for joining me. I enjoyed that immensely. Now, loyal listener, James's book is 8th Army versus Rommel: Tactics, Training and Operations in North Africa, 1940-42. As ever, I'll put a link on the website. Don't forget, if you're not already a patron of the podcast, you can find out more at patreon.com/WW2podcast. Next time out, we'll be looking at the Canadian wartime Prime Minister, Mackenzie King. So until then, I'm Angus Wallace, and thanks for listening.